Victory in the Colosseum. For a gladiator, this was everything. The roar of the crowd, a shower of prize money, and the simple fact that you were still breathing. Hollywood loves this image. The heroic survivor, his brutal chapter closed. But what if that victory wasn't the end? What if it was just the beginning of a private, hidden nightmare? For the gladiator who walked out of the arena alive, the fight was far from over. This is the dark side of the story, a look at how Roman gladiators lived after the cheering stopped. It was a reality of chronic pain, deep psychological trauma, and a strange kind of isolation that was often its own life sentence. First up, let's talk about the physical nightmare that lived inside a victorious gladiator's own body. We see chiseled, perfect figures in movies. But the reality was a life of non-stop, agonizing pain. To survive in the arena meant enduring injuries that would cripple anyone today. Archaeological evidence from a gladiator cemetery in Ephesus, Turkey, tells a gruesome story. Skeletons there show healed but incredibly severe head trauma, broken bones, and wounds from all sorts of weapons. These weren't clean injuries. We're talking about brutal, close-quarters damage. Now, gladiators were valuable property, so they often got better medical care than the average Roman. The famous physician Galen even got his start treating gladiators in Pergamon. He documented techniques for stitching up deep gashes and tying off arteries to stop bleeding. But even his best work couldn't erase the aftermath. Ancient medical texts talk about cleaning wounds with wine or vinegar, which probably had some antiseptic effect. But infection was a constant, deadly threat. A gladiator could survive a fight only to die a slow, agonizing death from sepsis weeks later, far from the roar of the crowd. This endless cycle of injury, recovery, and re-injury created a body that was a roadmap of past battles. Imagine living with a shoulder that never sat right again, a leg that ached with every single step, or phantom pains from a limb lost in the sand. Analysis of gladiator skeletons shows some shockingly advanced medical care for the time, like perfectly healed fractures and even clean amputations. But this just meant they were being patched up to fight again. The underlying damage was always there. Even their diet was part of the brutality. They were often fed high-carb vegetarian meals, heavy on barley and beans, to intentionally put on a layer of fat. This wasn't because they were out of shape. This flab was a strategic layer of protection. It could absorb shallow cuts, making the show bloodier and more dramatic for the audience without immediately hitting vital organs. So, the gladiator walking out of the arena wasn't a man restored to health. He was a man in a constant state of decay, carrying his victories as a collection of scars and aches that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The physical pain was only half the battle. Their minds were shattered too. Today, we have a name for it: post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. For the Roman gladiator, it was just an unnamed daily horror. The arena was a place of systematic violence, and gladiators only fought 2 or 3 times a year. This meant they spent most of their time living with the anticipation and memory of mortal combat. The experience of killing other people up close and constantly facing a gruesome death yourself leaves scars on the mind that never fade. Historians and psychologists today believe the trauma these men experienced was cumulative. You didn't just get used to it. Each fight added another layer of mental damage. On top of that, there was immense pressure to embody Roman virtus, that ideal of courage and manliness. A gladiator had to face death with a stoic, almost theatrical calm. Showing fear was a disgrace worse than dying. This need to wear a fearless mask while battling pure terror inside created a deeply damaging internal conflict. Can you imagine the nightmares? The recurring images of a fallen opponent, the roar of a crowd screaming for blood. In the gladiator school, or ludus, life was a brutal hierarchy where disobedience was met with whips or starvation. This environment, combined with the horrors of the arena, created a state of constant stress and hypervigilance. The Roman world had no real way to understand or treat this kind of trauma. They might give a soldier returning from a long campaign some time to decompress, but a gladiator was an asset, a performer. His mental state only mattered if it stopped him from fighting. So what did they do? They turned to superstition, praying to Nemesis, the goddess of retribution, or Fortuna, the goddess of luck, trying to find some sense of control. The psychological fallout could show up in many ways: explosive anger, deep depression, or just being emotionally numb. These were men trained for extreme violence, then expected to exist in a world they were totally unequipped for. The fight in the Colosseum might last minutes, but the war inside their minds would last a lifetime. Victory definitely brought fame. The names of top gladiators were household words, their faces scratched into graffiti on city walls. They were living symbols of Roman values like aggression and endurance. This fame also came with real rewards, prize money, gifts from rich fans, and the worship of the crowds. For a slave or a prisoner, this was a level of recognition they could get nowhere else. They were both the lowest of the low and the biggest celebrities. But this fame was a gilded cage. For all the cheers, a gladiator was still branded with infamia. This was a legal and social stain that marked them as people of low repute, in the same category as prostitutes and actors. A person with infamia was stripped of many rights of a citizen. They couldn't vote, hold public office, or even write a will to pass on the money they'd earned. They lived in a bizarre paradox, idolized in the arena, but shunned in polite society. This meant even a rich, famous gladiator was an outcast. He could be a celebrity, but he couldn't be a true citizen. He was admired from a distance, but never truly welcomed. This social isolation was a huge part of the post-victory nightmare. This strange conflict helps explain one of the most baffling stories from the gladiator world. The story of Flamma. His tombstone in Sicily says he fought 34 times, won 21 bouts, and was offered the rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized freedom, 4 times. He refused it every single time, choosing to stay a gladiator until he was killed in the arena at age 30. Why would anyone refuse freedom? Maybe because life as a freed gladiator wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Outside the arena, he'd just be another social outcast with a dark past. But inside the arena, he was Flamma the Flame, a legend. For him, and probably others, the identity and glory they found in the sand were worth more than a quiet life of being nobody. So what about the guys who did take the wooden sword and walk free? For many, the promise of a new life was just an illusion. The rudis wasn't a golden ticket to a peaceful retirement. It was often just an entry into a different kind of servitude, still tied to the violent world they thought they'd escaped. What could a freed gladiator, called a rudiarius, actually do? His options were incredibly limited. With a resume consisting of brutal combat and the social stain of infamia, most respectable jobs were off the table. So many of them stayed in the orbit of the arena. A common career path was becoming a trainer at a gladiator school, passing on their deadly skills to the next generation. They went from being the performers to being the harsh teachers. Others found work as referees, known as summa rudis, using their expertise to make sure the fights were a good show. Another popular gig was becoming a bodyguard for a rich politician or nobleman, where their proven skill for violence was a valuable asset. To cope with being social outcasts, gladiators both active and retired formed associations called collegia. These were like early trade unions or burial societies. Members paid dues, and in return, the collegium would guarantee a proper burial and help take care of a fallen comrade's family. It shows how they built their own brotherhood, finding the dignity and support within their ranks that the wider world denied them. Even for those who tried to leave it all behind, the arena had a way of pulling them back. Emperors were known to offer huge sums of money like the 100,000 sesterces offered by Emperor Tiberius to lure popular retired gladiators back for one more fight. Ultimately, freedom for a gladiator rarely meant an escape from violence. They were men shaped by the sand, and most of them remained tied to it for life. And the last piece of this nightmare was something a victorious gladiator could never escape: the weight of being a public spectacle. He wasn't just a fighter, he was a performance. And that performance didn't stop when he left the arena. The Roman crowd demanded a story. They wanted to see courage and style. A gladiator had to project an image of being invincible and fearless, even when he was terrified and exhausted. This public persona was a mask he could never really take off. When he walked down the street, he wasn't just a man. He was the hero or villain of the Colosseum. This constant scrutiny messes with your sense of self. Was he the person he was before? Or had he become the character he was forced to play? For many, the line blurred. The arena became their true identity, which might be why Flamma chose to stay. The fame was addictive, a powerful drug that gave a sense of purpose that was impossible to find anywhere else. The public's relationship with gladiators was a total mess. They were worshipped as celebrities, but legally branded as social trash. They were sex symbols, desired by men and women alike. But they were also seen as objects, commodities to be used. Even after being freed, Arudiarius was forever marked by his past. He was the guy who killed for public amusement. He could never fully blend into a society that had paid to watch him risk his life. True peace was impossible. His victory didn't really belong to him. It belonged to the crowd. He might have survived the arena, but by doing so, he became public property, forever defined by the spectators' gaze. The image of the triumphant gladiator, standing victorious under the Roman sun, is a powerful one, but it's incomplete. The true story of the survivor is one of a grim, relentless struggle. For the man who walked out of the Colosseum alive, the fight was just the beginning of a new, private war against a broken body, a haunted mind, and a society that celebrated him as a hero while shunning him as an outcast. Victory wasn't freedom. It was often a life sentence of pain and trauma. It meant living in a world where fame and infamy were two sides of the same coin. The wooden rudis might have broken the chains of slavery, but it couldn't sever the ties to a life of violence or erase the stigma that followed them to the grave. It just goes to show that for a gladiator, the real tragedy wasn't that he might die in the arena, but that if he survived, he was forced to live forever in its shadow.